on the mother's breast are spoken language. Dante thought that the language you learn to speak has no grammatical rules. He was Italian, of course, and so he thought of Latin like they think of Hebrew, that you go to school when you're a boy and you learn Latin, and then you go to school and your schooling is in Latin. And any of the spoken oral languages, which at that time, in the 14th century, didn't have writing, that's what you learn. You supple at your mother's breast, and you just sort of learn it. Okay? So in every language, the mother tongue is that native tongue that, for a while at least, everybody speaks. Some societies even. That gets complicated, but okay. So everybody speaks Yiddish, but what is the status of Yiddish? It had no written language for a very long time. It was the woman home language, intimacy. But at the other hand, it's also the language of intimacy. So it may have low status because it's not the religious language, it's not the schooling language, it's not the masculine language, but it's the language. That is tremendously important, and if I have a chance on Monday, there's so much to do that's interesting here. At the very end, I want to read you some passages about that, like Gloria Anzaldúa and people like that, who are bilingual and or diglossic, and how they relate to that. And if I had, if you got me drunk, I would tell you about my own life and my relation to Hungarian, Spanish, and English, and French, and in relation to that, but particularly to Hungarian, which is my first language, which was pre-sexual experience, but yet that's what even sexual experience gets tied into that because it's the first emotional feeling. Okay? So you have this society that the emotional home language is Yiddish, the high language is Hebrew, and then they all live somewhere because they have no nation, and so they gotta go to the market and sell their goods and so forth, so they speak at least some level of Polish or Russian or Hungarian, or they live on some border area and they speak several of them. So the average person was to some degree triglossic. Of course, the women very often only knew the prayers in Hebrew and whatever, and so they really weren't. On the other hand, the women tended to be better in the Polish and the Russian because the guys would be just doing their prayers all day, and it's the women who did all the work and went to the market. So they often were much better. And so then what happened in the 19th century, they started writing novels and things for women in Yiddish. So they started developing a written language. And it was the women who, through that, started reading modern literature and getting more secularized and more in touch, much like these women do with that fiction, getting in touch with that outside society. So the identities, the education, everything was different. But there was, and here's now our introduction, how languages are metaphorically gendered. It says, just like the relationship of language to, here you have, this is very important, the politics of language and the politics of gender are totally interrelated. So, the relationship of the linguistic gender division of labor in that society, or any society, and the other polarities, sacred, profane, educated, uneducated, religious, sacred, etc., etc. I'm going to repeat these polarities, will determine which language you speak of those possibilities. How well are you bilingual, trilingual, diglossic, etc. But in addition, Yiddish to that society, here was the definition of Yiddish. It was suggested that Yiddish is like a woman because it's subordinate to Hebrew, in the same way that women are subordinate to men. The gendering of language then connects with the sets of social factors that include education level, political, social, economic standing. That is, it has less power. It has emotion. It is the closest to you, but you can't go to law school with it. You can't go get higher education with it. Until late 19th century, you couldn't even read anything in it because nothing was written in it. So it gave you no power. It left you enclosed in the private sphere. You could not get out, but it gave you all that emotion. Thus, the gendering of languages works as a metaphor. And we're going to see this now. Your big assignment for Monday is that Moroccan article where we have classical Arabic, that's the language of the Quran, that's like Latin or Greek or Hebrew, that if nobody speaks it to start with. Then there is spoken Arabic of the particular place. And that's a dialect in the sense that most versions of that don't have a written language, and in each town there's differences. Then there's Berber, which is the secret underlying language that in fact most people learn, even if they weren't Berber, as a baby, because they weren't themselves Berber, they had a nursemaid who was Berber, because that's the poorest oral rural women are that. And then there's French, which is, as I said, the colonial language, but it is the opening to the West, and it is the secular language, and it's the open door to go to university elsewhere or to get a good job and all these things. And today there's even English to a large extent. So I want you to come back on Monday and tell me about the roles of each of those languages exactly, and with all those dichotomies that I also listed here, and how is each one gendered? Which of those languages is male, and which of those languages is female? Just like here, we saw this, okay? So, questions on this? Okay, quota to this, just because you're in New York, I said, oh, well, this was up to World War II when they killed them all. This was that society that died, but a few people survived, and among the very religious, because Jews who weren't very religious in places like Berlin, Vienna, and Budapest didn't speak Yiddish anymore, so that wasn't an issue. When they got urbanized, they didn't speak. So the poor Jews, the Orthodox Jews, those who survived, there's communities in Brooklyn, New York. You've seen them in furred hats and whatever. And they are, to this day, triglossic to some degree, because they keep the same thing that they push trying to speak Yiddish, and they speak Yiddish to their children because they actually feel that you're not allowed to speak Hebrew, because Hebrew is the language of God, and until the Messiah comes, you can't speak Hebrew. So they're against speaking. They read it, the prayers, and they do the prayers, but not for every. They make a separation between sacred life in the shul and everyday life. So Yiddish is the language they use. But many of them come from a greater area of Hungary, so many of them, actually their real native language is also Hungarian. And they're still trying to practice that in a totally artificial way, because of course they're all living in New York. So if they go into the city to whatever job, they also have to do some English. But very often they send their children to Jewish schools where they don't even learn English, so it's very problematic. Okay, let's, Susan Galt. So she is the one who started this whole thing, and diglossia is going to be the big word. Okay, some of you, quite a number of you are linguistics majors. Even some of them were sitting way back there now, I don't know why. Yes, I think I know why, but you shouldn't be sitting there. You're one of the people who participates. So, what is diglossia? I should pick on you for sitting back there. What is diglossia? Let's define first diglossia, because that's going to be constantly coming up. Diglossia is used here. Then I'll tell you a little bit of how it was usually when it was coined in the 1960s, but that's not so important anymore. So what is diglossia? Come on. You're a linguistics major. Somebody should know. Yes?
It's not necessarily bilingualism, because they can be like variations of the same language, and they're used in specific contexts, so they each have their social niche, I guess.
It's interesting what you say, because it's true as far as it goes, but you're using the old definition. You learned that in some sociolinguistics class, and it's outdated. I'm not picking on you for that, but I'm really angry at sociolinguists who don't understand that it's much beyond that. Okay, so let's take your definition, then we'll do it your way. So, in a classic sociolinguistic analysis, when diglossia was coined in 1962 or so by a sociolinguist, he said, well, there are languages like, and the examples were Greece, where there's also the classical Greek, which is not spoken by anyone, and the spoken Greek, the demotiki. Okay, so that meant that that society was diglossic because the spoken language was Greek, and the high language, like Latin would be in Europe, was the prestige language of the old literature and various things. Right? Then he used the example of Switzerland, where there are 13 dialects of so-called Swiss German. But when you go to school, those dialects are not written or anything. you don't just get alphabetized, you don't learn to read and write, you have to learn to read and write in what is called High German, which is the standard German you learn in school. Even though nobody has that as a native language in Switzerland, okay? So there's this dichotomy, and then he had Haiti and another example, but Swiss German is perhaps the clearest example, because in all of the examples, all four he had, the two languages are, as you said, related. So like, it would be like saying, if we lived in the Middle Ages, and school was only in France, Italy, and Spain, school was only in Latin, which is what it was, but at home you spoke some dialect of what we today call Spanish or French or Italian. It wasn't that at that time. And so the two languages are related because one is the granddaughter of the other, but there are different stages of it. One is the old written language, that's the classical one, perhaps the language of religion or whatever, and the other is just an oral dialect, but they're related. So yeah.
Yeah, so just like to clarify, it's like when you speak two language, but like one of them is like not an authentic language.
No, not authentic, we wouldn't use that in linguistics, no. One is what you speak at home, what you learn, and the other is an older stage of that language that has been petrified because it has an old literature, or like Egyptian Arabic versus the Quranic Arabic.
Yeah, I was just saying like authenticity in the sense that like the language that comes first is often perceived as being more authentic.
Okay, but let's call it, but some people will say, well, the Quran's language is the more authentic, right, you see? So that's a dangerous word. Yes?
So, could you say that like Hebrew and Yiddish have a similar relationship?
No. Or yes,
no,
but
to Dutch and Afrikaans, or is that different?
you're getting ahead of me.
Sorry.
Right, because, okay, so let's stay with this, what she brought up, because that's the original definition. So, do we get the original definition? And I had a TA once here in this class who only knew that definition, and he marked the answers wrong for all the students, and we had to redo all the exams. Okay, so the original definition is that there are two languages, but they're related, okay? And normally, in fact, one is the dead old part, and one is the living version, and usually the living version is not even written, so that's why Swiss German is a wonderful example, because there are 13 dialects of that language, and until recently none of them were really written. But the written language in that case is not an old dead version of German, it's the written language of Germany. So that one is not an older language, but the two forms are always related. But they have different roles, right? So it's not bilingualism that here I speak, I go get on an airplane like I'm Hungarian and English bilingual, and that if I get on an airplane, I could give this lecture in Hungarian, and I do it here in English, and I go to Spain and I give it in Spanish. That means I'm trilingual because I'm using it. I can order a meal in a restaurant and I can give a lecture, right? So I'm using it at every level. Whereas if I'm in Swiss Germany, I speak Swiss German of my particular dialect, but when I go into the university, it's run in German, right? And then there are things in between. The church normally is run in the high language. The radio may now, there are more local programs. There are things in between that are changing, but basically one is the low language, the low prestige, even though that's the one that you're saying is authentic, and it's true. It's authentic because that's the one you speak, but...
well, it's perceived as not being authentic.
Yes, exactly. It's perceived that way. So the one that your mother taught you, that you spoke at home. Okay, but in that first definition, those two languages are in some way related languages, right? From the same language family. Yeah.
So does it have to do with like whether or not it's like institutionalized? Is that like the
yes? Yes, you could say that. The high one is institutionalized. It could be the language of religion. It could be language of education, or both. The language of law. All the high things. And when you get to the Gall article, you will see charts to make this simpler, where it says who would you talk to in court? What does the television say, and so forth. Television sometimes has popular things. Okay. Now we get to you. The more expanded definition, because then people began to see that you have exactly that situation in many cases where the two languages are not related at all. That's not the reason you could have for other reasons. So yes, Hebrew and Yiddish, to answer your question, are totally unrelated, but Yiddish is actually related to German, and German doesn't get into the story here at all.